Before I begin, I've got another audio bonus that's just too hot for this place. It's two short statements, one from Cardinal Burke and the other from Archbishop Vigano, both on the visit of the man that I call Drowsy Caesar to Pope Francis. And Francis telling him how great a Catholic he is and that he should just keep receiving the Eucharist. Both of those bishops thought that they should issue formal corrections to Francis, and that's fine. They just wouldn't fly here. So I've got them available for you. Check the pinned comment below for a link to an embedded player that will take you to my sources site, or find Return to Tradition on Spotify, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, or really any of the big podcasting hosting platforms if you would like to hear it. Plus, those sites are a great way to follow this channel and others like it as a backup in these turbulent times. That having been said, we know that Francis teaches a new gospel, one that departs from the gospel of Christ. From the time to time, I see that the anonymous priest in the Roman Curia that brings tidbits of wisdom and insider information and gives them to Italian journalist Marco Tossati, he does sometimes release new information, and he just released a thought to Mr. Tossati that reflects on the visit of Drowsy Caesar to Francis in Rome recently. That American public figure said that Francis was his kind of Catholic, a kind man who exemplified the kindness and welcoming nature of Christ. He then went on to say a day or so later that the Moloch issue is one that he is committed to defending despite his own Catholic faith standing in opposition to it. So it goes. But one area he praised Francis on was for his focus on what Francis calls the care for our common home. You know, the subject of his encyclical Laudato Si that we can never escape from, and all things that involve the hugging of trees. That topic is back in the news in general because Francis addressed the meeting of the Leviathan in Scotland over that very issue in a big conference that just hasn't gotten enough attention in general, where the secular authority is going to make moves to restrict what you and I can eat and how much of it we can eat in the name of the thermometer and care for the created world. It's all really so tiresome, and it's being enabled by Francis the Merciful. The anonymous priest in his statement calls Francis's involvement with this a new gospel, a false gospel, and that whenever Francis speaks on this care for creation topic, his defenders come out and scramble to find a Catholic phrase in his release to reassure them that, Francis is still Catholic. It's a bit like trying to find a needle in a haystack. These defenders, and especially the prelates who do this, do so out of fear of retribution, as Francis the Merciful and Kind is known to unleash his wrath on those who cross him. Quote, in fact, we read the career of Bergoglianized Catholics for the terror of being under investigation or fired, who on the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si break their backs to lick their socks, exalting this encyclical. End quote. I'm wondering if licking socks is an Italian expression. I'm not familiar with it, but I like it already. There, though, the priest speaks of Laudato Si and how nearly every bishop in the church has tripped over themselves to say how wonderful a document it was, despite that encyclical being Francis's document that sold the church to her enemies. It is this concern for the created world that is the false gospel, a faith all its own, and one that certainly isn't our faith. The anonymous priest gives us a right-ordered response to concerns about what Francis calls our common home, because the concerns themselves are fine. It's just what happens with them. His point is this: if there is a problem in the created world and the relationship of man to it, neither Francis nor his allies are looking in the right place for a solution. They should look to our morals and to our virtues, or lack thereof, and not to the material to solve the material problem. Quote, I would like to convince the reader that if the created world suffers, it is thanks to sin, to the loss of faith. This should be the work of the Pope, who instead accompanies his Moloch-serving friends, who instead teach to destroy creatures and creation. I will try to explain it with two evangelical references, Matthew and Mark, which a pope should know well. In Matthew, chapter 27, verse 45, commenting on the crucifixion and death of Christ, from noon to 3 in the afternoon, darkness fell over the whole earth. Jesus expired. Then in chapter 27, verse 51, and behold, the veil of the temple was torn. The earth shook, the rocks were broken. In Mark, chapter 15, verse 33, when noon came, there was darkness over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. The Navarre Bible comments on this point of the Gospels, citing the interpretation of St. Jerome in Romans chapter 8, verses 19 to 22. And the comment in Matthew, which observes that darkness expresses the mourning of the universe for its creator, and the protest of nature against the wicked death of his Lord. Attention, this is the key point. The created world complained about sin, the cause, and its consequences, bad behavior. If you do not address the source of the problem, sin, but only the consequences, the Laudato Si topic, it will only make things worse. But what should a pontiff worry about? Of the causes or of the effects? Another lectio always comes to us from St. Paul in the Romans chapter 8, verses 19 to 22, who writes, "Creation awaits with great longing the manifestation of the sons of God. That is, only the glorification of the soul and the body will satisfy all creation." End quote. What he's saying here is actually pretty simple. There is a false gospel being preached, one that is purely material in nature. The Church, through the office of the Pope, has always commented on and tried to provide real leadership on the issues of the day that the secular world is concerned with. The same is true here, and in general, that's fine. Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum offered a good critique of the woes of the Gilded Age and offered a third-way option between the two economic ideologies that were battling it out in the public square then and still are now. His successors built on his work, leading to the creation of the modern body of Catholic social teaching. All of that is fine. Some of it is a magnificent work, because those options were rooted in Catholic moral sense, and while concerned with the material issues of the day, they were focused on the spiritual nature of things, and the gospel was a solution. The religious nature of things at that time and how they interacted with the material concerns of the day were addressed with the gospel. I know that sounds groundbreaking in our time. Laudato Si, the Amazon Synod, Fratelli Tutti, and all of Francis's major works on material problems in our time do quite the opposite. They embrace the secular concern, and then they try to ram them into the faith. It doesn't work, and is a twisting of the gospel to fit a purpose that is wholly not Catholic. The anonymous priest ends his thought exercise with this: it would serve the Church to address the problems through the lens of sin and Catholic morality, and that to meaningfully address them, it would have to been appropriate to address them using the Feast of Christ the King, which on the TLM calendar just happened this past Sunday. Of course, Francis is probably only vaguely aware, if at all, that the pre-conciliar calendar had the Feast of Christ the King this past Sunday, given his hostility to all things sacred tradition. But it is the concept of a false gospel that I want to focus on here. In his epistle to the Galatians, St. Paul tells us this important fact of the faith: follow only the gospel of Christ. Quote, "I wonder that you are so removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, only there are some that trouble you and would twist the gospel of Christ. But though we or an angel from heaven preach a gospel to you besides that which we have preached to you, let him be anathema. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preach to you a gospel besides that which you have received, let him be anathema. For do I now persuade man or God? Or do I seek to please man? If I yet pleased men, I should not be the servant of Christ." End quote. Do we seek to please men or to please God? The false gospel we see on display today, that the new gospel that is not from Christ, even if its adherents claim it to be of Christ, preach something that comes from that group that I generally call the stonecutters. I want to remind listeners of something. In the papacy of Leo XIII, the pontiff was brought a copy of a document called the Permanent Instruction, published by a group calling itself the Alta Vendita. It detailed a mission of the stonecutters to turn the church into the instrument of the secular world, to have the church preach its gospel, not the gospel of Christ. If you're not familiar with it, don't worry, I've got sort of the money excerpt here, and I've got a link to it in my show notes today, and I'll go over that in a minute. Here is an excerpt of that to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Quote, "We do not intend to win the popes to our cause, to make them neophytes of our principles, propagators of our ideas. That would be a ridiculous dream, and if events turn out in some way, if cardinals or prelates, for example, of their own free will or by surprise, should enter into a part of our secrets, this is not at all incentive for desiring their elevation to the see of Peter. That elevation would ruin us. Ambition alone would have led them to apostasy. The requirements of power would force them to sacrifice us. What we must ask for, what we should look for and wait for, as our elder brothers wait for the Messiah, is a pope according to our needs. We have the little finger of the successor of Peter engaged in the ploy, and this little finger is as good for this work as all the Urban IIs and all the St. Bernards in Christendom. We have no doubt that we will arrive at the supreme end of our efforts. Now then, to assure ourselves a pope of the required dimensions, it is a question first of shaping for this pope a generation worthy of the reign we are dreaming of." End quote. The author of this says to bypass entirely the existing generation and focus on the catechumens and the seminarians. Focus on the future, not on those in the present. That is, to teach the seminarians, catechumens, and those in formation the values of the world, the values of France in 1789, to form their minds in the secular world, not in the faith. This all sound familiar to you? It should. This document was found in the late 19th century and presented to Leo XIII, who, along with St. Pius X, his successor, Both published it in English, German, and other languages at their own personal expense, not at that of the Vatican treasury, so that the faithful could know what the adversary was doing. Remember, this is at the heart of what modernism is. This is partially how we got to this place in the church now. The stonecutters in question, of course, when confronted with this, denied the document's veracity because, of course, they would. But that's not all. Here's where the permanent instruction gets to the point. Quote, "You will contrive for yourselves, at little cost, a reputation as good Catholics. This reputation will put access to our doctrines into the midst of the young clergy, as well as deeply into the monasteries. In a few years, by the force of things, this young clergy will have overrun all the functions. They will form the sovereign's council. They will be called to choose a pontiff who should reign. And this pontiff, like most of his contemporaries, will be necessarily more or less imbued with the Italian and humanitarian principles that we are going to begin to put into circulation. It is a small grain of black mustard that we are entrusting to the ground, but the sunshine of justice will develop it up to the highest power, and you will see one day what a rich harvest the small seed will produce. In the path that we are laying out for our brethren, there are found great obstacles to conquer, difficulties of more than one kind to master. They will triumph over them by experience and by clear-sightedness, but the goal is so splendid that it is important to put all the sails to the wind in order to reach it. You want to change Italy. Look for the Pope whose portrait we have just drawn. You wish to establish our reign. Let the clergy march under your standard, always believing that they are marching under the banner of the apostolic keys. Let your snares, your nets, like Simon Barjona, lay them in the sacristies, the seminaries, and the monasteries, rather than at the bottom of the sea, and if you do not hurry, we promise you a catch more miraculous than his. The fisher of fish became the fisher of men. You will bring friends around the apostolic chair. You will have preached a mission in Tiara and Cope, a mission that will need to be only a little bit urged on to set fire to the four corners of the world." End quote. If you're not familiar with the permanent instruction, the Fatima Center has copies for sale in print. You can also find it online. I have a link to it and to everything else I cited today in my show notes at returntotradition.org, as usual. That's the name of this channel or podcast with a .org at the end. Trust me, if you haven't read this, if you're not familiar with it, you want to read it. It's not long, and it explains exactly how we got to where we are. It's the infiltration thesis, the driving document of that argument, made easy to understand for the typical person. But the point is this. We live, and have lived now, for several decades at least, in the times described by this document. Every one of the popes since the council has been, to some degree, partnered with the beast, and adopted their language and ideals of the secular and attempted to make them Catholic, have been this instrument for this mission in Tiara and Cope. Francis is just the most obvious expression of this, with his overt partnerships with the servants of Moloch, and his telling Caesar just how good a Catholic he is, and that he should just keep receiving the Eucharist. It's also tiresome. But in this time, as we approach the fasting season of Advent, it is worth remembering that the best way we can resist this is to, one, of course, tell the truth, and always tell the truth, and two, simply conform our lives to the gospel of Christ, to seek out the sacraments, develop our prayer life, fast, abstain, offer little sacrifices daily for the salvation of souls, for the holy souls in purgatory, and for reparation for sins. And at Fatima, Our Lady gave us the remedy, praying the rosary and keeping the 5 first Saturdays devotion. This coming Saturday is the first Saturday, and if you haven't heard of the first Saturday devotion, I'll have a video in the recommended videos at the end of this one that tells you how to do it, and I'll try to have it linked in the pinned comment below. The time is now to do it, and we won't get the other promised solution to this until the laity have kept that devotion. That other promised solution is the consecration of Russia to Our Lady's Immaculate Heart, which has not been done. As numerous priests who were there at all the consecrations to the world, which was not what was requested at Fatima, as they all have said themselves. And by now it should be obvious given the state of things. But that is it. That is the new gospel of Francis and where it comes from. It's a gospel placing our trust in the earthly princes, who are the adversaries of the faith, for their programs, and in dismissing the gospel of Christ or trying to make it fit to the needs of that new gospel of the princes of the world, omitting all the hard parts and leaving us only with a false image of our Lord who sees the needs of the princes of the world. That's the essence of his new gospel, and as Catholics we must hold to the gospel of Christ, the deposit of the faith, and we must do the works necessary to show God that we warrant being freed from these evil times. So please turn your eyes to heaven and to the gospel in these times. Now, am I correct, or have I just completely lost it? Is Francis preaching a new secular gospel? Let me know in the comments, please, and like and subscribe if you haven't. It really does help. As always, pray for the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.